Alright, in this video I'm going to be talking about inheritance, and before we get into inheritance we're going to look at classes again because you need to have a really good handle on classes before we start talking about inheritance. Now what I have here is a class diagram. We have a class for address, and in the diagram it lists all of the members of that class. Up top we've got a street, a city, a state. These are all variables that belong to this class. And sometimes in diagrams they will list the data type. So a street, we would say that is a string. I imagine all of these would be strings, but sometimes you will see that listed as well. And down below your member variables, you're going to have your member functions. And in Java we call those methods, whereas technically a method is just a function that belongs to a class. And in Java, for the most part, every function belongs to some class, so they are all methods. Anyways, you have a validate method down here, and you have an output as label method. So those are your class functions. Over here we have a person class. Person has a name, a phone number, it has an address that's coming from over here, and an email address, and then it has a purchase parking pass method. And that is what makes up the person class. Remember that a class itself is not an object. A class is just like a blueprint or a template for an object that could exist in your program. And in fact, we can use the same class to create several objects. And so I like to use Legos as sort of an illustration of how a class works. If you've ever messed with Legos, you've seen one of these. These are the instructions on how to build a Lego race car. The instructions are not the car itself, and so you want to think of that when you're thinking of classes. They are the instructions or the blueprints for something that can exist, but they are not the object itself. In the instructions that list all of the pieces and how many you have, these are like our member variables right here. And then it shows how to put this object together. The instructions on building the object in your class, that is going to be your constructor. And if you're curious as to what is the object itself, in main, when you would say object equals new object, that's going to go out in the memory, allocate some memory, and it's going to construct that object. So the object itself is going to be your bits in the memory. And like I said, we can create several race cars using this one set of instructions. It's the same way with classes. We can create any number of objects using the same blueprint, the same class. With inheritance, we're going to take advantage of one class to create a new class. So in this program here, we have person as our base class, and then from person we're going to derive other classes. And in this diagram, they've got a professor, and a professor has everything a person has. It has all of these elements to it, but it also has a salary. Student is also a person, so that's going to be a separate class, but it is going to be derived from person, just like professor. And it will have its own unique variables. Here we have a student number and an average mark, and also some methods that only apply to students. So if we were to create a student in main or some other area of our program, it would have a student number and an average mark, but it would also have a name and phone number and so on. It does not get anything from professor, and professor does not get anything from student. And so that is how the hierarchy of classes work. We would call this the superclass, and this the subclass. Sometimes we call this the base class and the derived class. And another one is parent class and child class. And you can use any of those or mix and match them however you want, as long as you know which is which. All right, so to set this up in code in Java, you can create classes up here in the same file, but it is customary to create them in separate files. So we'll look at creating new files and put our classes in those files. We want to take note of the package that we have here. The package kind of keeps all of our files together in one program, and it helps the compiler recognize what belongs to what. To create a new class in a separate file, you would right-click on your project, go to New, and then select Java Class. When you get this window here, give your class a name. If I were following the diagram that I showed you earlier, I would make this class Person, because that is our base class. We'll keep our project name the same. We will use our package inheritance lab, that's what I called it, and click Finish. So you can see our person.java file has been added, and we have our class over here. So let's go ahead and add the things that are on that diagram. We have a name. We have a name, a phone number, an address, and email address. I'm not going to create the address class. I'm just going to leave this as a string for now to keep it simple. We'll put in these 4 members, and then we'll add a method down here. And then for our method here, I will call this purchase parking pass. It doesn't list the return type, so I'm going to assume this is a void method. I can change it later if I need to. Inside this method, nothing's really going on. I'm just going to print that we did purchase a parking pass. Now that we have our base class, we can start working on inheritance. So we're going to go create another class. This time we're wanting to create student or professor. So we'll do that same thing again. New Java class. Give our class the name student. Make sure you select the package and finish. To implement the inheritance, to say that this is not a standalone class, but that it does inherit from person, you would type extends person. And that's going to bring in everything that we have in person. And now we can add our student ID. I'll just call it ID number. And in our diagram, the other one was average mark. We'll make that a float and say average mark. We've got 2 methods, is eligible to enroll and get seminars taken. Both of these functions would be returning something. Is eligible to enroll, that's a yes or no question, so this would return a bool, and get seminars taken would return seminars. We don't have seminars, so I'm not going to mess with that one. But we'll go ahead and write this method in. And inside this method, we just need to return true or false. To keep it simple, I'm just going to return true. Sorry, this is Java. We have to type out Boolean. In C++, it's bool. In Java, it's Boolean. And now we have a student that inherits from person, and it also has a few members of its own. So let's test this out. We can go to main. In main, I will try to create a student. Student equals new student. After I create my student, I can verify that I do have all of the person variables. And IntelliSense will help us out here. When I push the dot, it brings this up, and it shows that I have an address, I have an email, a name, and in NetBeans, the ones that belong directly to the student class are in bold, and the methods and members that are inherited from some other class are just in standard font. So you can see that is eligible to enroll actually belongs to the student class, and these other ones are inherited. So I will go ahead and use some of these variables. In number, I just realized that should be ID number. So I'll correct that there. ID number. And we'll run this program. It's not going to do anything. But we see that it works just fine. Everything was successful. It shows that I do have the inheritance from person, and then I also have my own member variables. And the same is true with methods. We can go ahead and test out the person method here, purchase parking pass. And we'll run the program again. We get our little confirmation message down there, and that tells us that our inheritance is working just fine. So that is the basics of inheritance. We are using a base class to provide some member variables to multiple other classes that also need those variables. And what this does is it saves you a lot of time. You don't have to retype all of this stuff every time you create a new class. It also provides you a way of organizing your code a little bit better. Inheritance is also going to pave the way for polymorphism, which is a very powerful and useful tool in object-oriented programming. So we'll talk about that in the next topic.